today's poetry reading is the third and final event accompanying the Thousand Secrets exhibition. And I just want to say a little bit about the two that have preceded them and how I see these respective programming events fitting together. And so in each of the events, I've really tried to bring together different thinkers, authors, artists who are researching and working across different oceanic traditions of knowledge making, theorizing, folks who are thinking from different spaces, and also that allow us to see different relationships to history, to storytelling, to material cross currents that allow us to see forms of interconnection and to explore the ocean both as an archive of violence, dispossession, precarity, through the histories and legacies, for example, of the transatlantic slave trade, Indian Ocean indenture, to contemporary migrations, the global pandemic, but at the same time push us to see modes of relationality, world making, creative combination, kinship. And so all of the works that were featured in the exhibition kind of refuse this spectacular voyeuristic approach to the visual aspects of violence. It's refusing the brandishing of bodies, of the spectacle, and really getting us to unpack different tools of understanding the historical roots of contemporary crisis, but also to think and challenge notions of linear time itself. We can see multiple aspects of time and temporality unfolding at the same time, folding into one another. And I think that this question of how multiple geographies, temporalities, modes of social relation really come into focus when we think about the world's waters, thinking below the to the ocean floor, as some of the artists and speakers have got us to think with, to the materiality of the water, to the histories of the vessels that have crossed, and the lives of the people who are variously positioned in the world's ports. And so I see today's speakers, Aracelis Girmay and Craig Santos Perez, as two additional writers whose poetry very much speaks to these tensions, to processes of ecology, ecohumanism, migration, belonging in these very complex ways, and allows us to think about the particularities of working across Atlantic and Pacific epistemologies, thinking through indigeneity and alternative forms of humanism can really help us to see not just bringing new worlds into being, but observing and indexing worlds that have existed all around us for some time. And so I'll begin with Aracelis, who is the author of 3 poetry collections, most recently The Black Maria in 2016, which she will be reading from today. She writes poems, essays, and literature for very young people, and her work was a finalist for the Neustadt International Prize for Literature. She curated How to Carry Water, selected poems for Lucille Clifton. And our second reader today will be Craig Santos Perez, who is an indigenous Chamoru from the Pacific island of Guam. He is the co-editor of 6 anthologies and the author of 5 poetry collections, as well as the monograph Navigating Chamoru Poetry, Indigeneity, Aesthetics, and Decolonization, which was out this year. He's a professor in the English department and affiliate with the faculty at the Center for Pacific Island Studies and Indigenous Politics at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So thank you so much for joining me. I will now turn it over to Aracelis. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much, May, and congratulations too. It's really an honor to get to be here in conversation with you all. And Craig, I'm looking forward to hearing you. So enormous thanks for bringing us together and for what's to come. I thought that I would start with a small note, as you encouraged us to think about sharing something of the roots of the work that we're sharing today. And so I thought, let me write it down because that's probably best for everyone. So I just wanted to read a small excerpt, the way that my book begins, which begins with a note. And then I also wanted to share a little bit from an interview of a conversation that I had, an interview / conversation that I had with Chen around the time of my book's publication. And Chen is a brilliant, beautiful poet who wanted to be in conversation about the roots of the book. So I'll share this note and then this section from an interview before I read the poems. It is estimated that over 20,000 people have died at sea, making the journey from North Africa to Europe in the past 2 decades. And I wrote that in 2013, of course, terribly, that number is much higher. On October 3rd, 2013, it is estimated that 300 people died at sea off the coast of Lampedusa. Those on board the boat that sank were nearly all Eritrean. This cycle of poems focuses on Eritrean history, as this is a history I'm somewhat familiar with as someone of its diaspora, but of course the history of people searching for political asylum and opportunity both is much larger than Eritrean history alone. It seems that I didn't choose to write about the sea in any conscious way. It just was always there in our history, my history, the history of people and places now called Eritrea, the United States, Boriken, Puerto Rico, the African Americas, and on and on. I originally thought that I was working on something entirely else, also to do with the sea, but much broader. But in 2013, that work was struck down by a devastating urgency and need to focus on the sea crossings of people out of Northern Africa and into Southern Europe. I was asking, how are these sea crossings different but connected to the other ways people, Black people in particular, have crossed and been made to cross the seas? What is revealed when I listen toward the ways that these histories and legacies actually touch each other and touch each other in me? Suddenly, the sea as ever moving, happening, behaving as the land is too, but in a differently perceptible way. With the sea and in these contexts mentioned above, there's no illusion for me of safety. Loss feels obvious, imminent. Standing at the horizon, looking out, the person is small, small, up against all else. In the first section of the book, I focus mainly on these recent sea crossings into Southern Europe. I try to address the sea, and I was interested in what felt to me like the impossibility of that, of trying to address. I was interested in the effort and strain that it called up in me, and the strike of the questions that I was then forced to ask myself about tense, time, address, perspective. I began to ask for it to shape my ear, my sense, in ways I had not asked or thought before. The severity of constructions like country and citizenry sharpen, become more foreign, and I am grateful. So I'll read some poems. Just writing down for time. This is part of a section of the poem that's written toward the dead. Beloveds, beneath the surface of your last place, the tiny oblivious fishes form wreaths above the seagrasses and their long reach. Some mornings in my own city far away, I run to greet you, come to me as sea, and carry myself out into your long dark time like a child meeting its older cousins. I touch your teeth and give you the single word of my body. I am a woman again at the side of Aboy Haile's bed. Aboy, who is 96. He is brushing my acacia hair. He is holding my arm. He says, moving his hand to mean all around us, that this is my home. He means Adisokto, but he also means the world. Though I think in America that I am there and he is here, that we are different or far, really we are each other. My bones are your bones, he says. His teeth are my teeth, and my smiling is his smiling. He holds my arm tight until it is a stone, a bone. He smooths my hair with force. I am a horse. The long, dark skin of the water, the talking Aboy of the water, the brushing back my acacia hair, washing my face. When we are done, I cross the sea back into air and return to the traffic of the streets I know. I am marked by the dead, your sea letters of salt and weeping. Now I am ready to lay myself down on the earth, to listen to the instructions for how to talk of love and land, to sing of home in the horrible years, and to fill my language like the stars do with the light anyway of a future tense. Hands. I should say this is after Patrick Rosal. Wonderful, beautiful poet, brilliant person. Hands for pleasure, hands for mending, shirts, hands for making and for taking, hands for killing, hands for cutting, hands for eating, feeding, shutting, hands for writing, hands for touching the ears of donkeys, hands for washing, hands for cooking and for tea, hand for brushing your sister's hair, hands for injera, hands for prayer, hands for building the house, hand for feeding chickens, hands for holding hands for coal, for carrying books, hands for guns, hands for sleeping, but hands for doing nothing. Hands for touching his face, hands for wiping tears, but the handlessness of water, the handlessness of sky and boats, the sea handless, having evolved without them, unable to do how the handed do, yet the distance and the ushering of the dead into the distance. This poem is a poem that's looking toward, among other things, Romare Bearden's The Siren Song. And in one corner of the sky, near the horizon line of the piece, Romare Bearden has signed his name. And the name Romare means Rome, which feels important for different reasons. One of them thinking about Eritrea's relationship to Italy and Italy as an occupying colonial force in Eritrea. Claim I to be the poet making talk, the sirens who foreground the scene where even the sky sings more air, Romare, Romare, whose body is a morning sound. Blood hyphened by the fleet to Saint-Domingue to Rome is siren speech. But listen closely. It is my mouth wailing redly into the scene from the future nose. It is my history rating me, Romare. Teach me how to read this blues, please, differently, how not to assign all blackness near the sea a captivity. I, the descendant of each early war who cannot remember peace, have taken hostage the greenness of my own mind. Want the sirens to be only the sirens, the sea to be only the sea. Oh, magnolia without blood, blackness without blood. This section is called To the Sea Near Lampedusa. For the eyes we closed, for safety and distance, for the freedom we wasted on things, the terrors our acts lit into the wet retina of your memory, if you should call it that. For the years you behaved in a distance that was not quite distance, as we burned our fires each other, and you, handless, please. The silence is what we feed, what burns in the bright absence of the living they were, swollen in flower, shirts, and in boots meant for the earth, but not for you. Luam to the dead. This takes place in Umbertide, Italy. The news announces your last place, a picture of rocks and sand. Having slipped through the seam of one realm into another, through into the lost where hours no longer touch you, we wait and wait. A figure catches in the street, your color, your height, the rareness of both in this town. But you are the nothing now, except what history carries in its dog teeth. Life, my luxury, my room alone at the hill's green foot, my view of racket and deer. At night, I run the shower to warm me. The water, it comes suddenly, cousin, my hand through you. This is a poem that's like this big, but the notes are really long. And in preparing to read for you all, I was kind of wondering how much of the notes to share. And I think all I want to say right now is that this poem is thinking about an afterworld sea, or imagining a sea in which some of the characters, there are characters in this book called the Luams, which are three different people named Luam who are kind of each other's parallels. One of the Luams is in Eritrea, one is in Italy, and one is in the US, and they're all the same age. And so it's a kind of way of thinking about and imagining something I've always imagined, which is like, what if my dad hadn't left there? Would I be? And if I were, then what and who and how would I be? So one of the Luams is in the afterworld sea with other girls who are carrying these sounds that mean different things in each of their languages. Luam, asa luam. Asa means fish luam, in Tigrinya. There was a water song that we sang when we were going to fetch river from the river. It was filled with water sounds and pebbles. Here in the afterwind with the other girls, we trade words like special things. One girl tells me Mai was her sister's name, the word for flower. She has been saving this one for a special trade. I understand and am quiet a while, respecting. Then give her my word, Mai, for water. And another girl tells me Mai is mother in her language, and another says it meant to her what belongs to me. Then belonging suddenly is a strange word, or a way of feeling like to be longing for. And you, brother, are the only one I think of to finish that thought, to be longing for my brother, my brother. I should also mention that I'm thinking about this story of the great-grandfather of the poet Alexander Pushkin, who was from somewhere on the continent of Africa. Different places claim him. Eritrea has a statue of Pushkin as a descendant. But thinking just about that specific history, but also the separation of people, but siblings, and the bonds between siblings. I've been thinking so much about that because of the great work of Usma Aslam Khan. But these bonds between siblings, that is what that poem carries. I'll just read a couple more, just a few more minutes. To the sea. You who cannot hear or cannot know the terrible intricacies of our species, our minds, the extent to which we have done what we have done, and yet the depth to which we have loved what we have loved. The hillside at dawn, dark eyes outlined with the dark sentences of coal. The fool we shared beneath the lime tree at the general's house after visiting Goitom in prison for trying to leave the country the first time. The apricot color of camels racing on the floor of the world as the fires blazed in celebration of independence. How dare I move into the dark space of your body, carrying my dreams without an invitation, my dreams wandering in ellipses, pet goats or chickens devouring your yard and shirts. See, my oblivious afterworld, grant us entry, please, when we knock, but do not keep us there. Deliver our flowers and hambasha bread, though we can't imagine now what our dead might need, and above all, can't imagine it is over, and that they are in fact askless, are needless in fact, still hold somewhere the smell of coffee smoking in the house, please, the memory of joy fluttering like a curtain in an open window, somewhere inside the brain's secret luster where a woman, hands red with henna, beats the carpet clean with the stick of a broom, and the children in the distance choose stones for the competition of stones. And the summer wears a crown of beles in her green hair, and the Tigadelti's white teeth and the beautiful bones of Massawa, the gaping eyes and mouths of its arches worn clean by the sea, your breath and your salt. Please, you, being water too, find a way into the air and then the river and the spring, so that your waters can wash the elders with the medicine of the trying of their children, cold and clean. And I'm just thinking about how it took me so long to realize that there was something, I don't know what the word is, not valuable, but shareable about kind of the particularity of my own family's migrations. I think I kept them separate in my mind for so long, even though, of course, they were already connected. And thinking of my mom's side, Puerto Rican, African American, from meeting in Chicago, and my dad, Eritrean, meeting my mom in Nairobi. So somewhere I got the idea to keep them separate. This story from that one, these stars from those, the history of this sea from the history of that sea. Separating the body into territories of easy sense, while overhead the sky marked by light is red in the constellations of someone else's myth. But the angles I chart abide by different sight, and hover up not as bearers or sisters, but a root dense with fires. Dark time adorned by the messages of mirrors saying, you are made with everywhere. I'll close there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely incredible. I've been scribbling so much, trying to keep up with everything, and I'll just say thank you. And I was incredibly moved, and I have so many questions to ask. We'll let Craig read then, and then we'll have a chance for each of you to dialogue a bit before I pose the questions. And I will remind anybody who has questions to feel free to put them in the chat as they arrive, and we'll make sure to hold space to answer those. Thank you.
Well, Hafade Todosamzu. Hello, everyone. Sidus Ma'asime, thank you for your profound vision for this exhibition and your very generous invitation to engage today. Thank you to all the folks at Apex Art for focusing on such an important topic during these times. I wish I could be there in person to be immersed in the show, and I hope everyone who is there gets a chance to do so. Thank you also to Aracelis for that very moving reading. It's always so stunning to be in the presence of your voice and your poems. For my contribution today, I'm going to read from my 2020 poetry publication entitled Habitat Threshold. It's a collection of eco and climate poetry. I started writing it in 2014. When my first daughter was born, and the meeting of the United Nations Climate Summit happened at the same time. So a lot of those themes came together in this book. I've chosen poems that all relate to the ocean in a way. It kind of flows through these works in different passages. And they're also in very different voices of and different types of poems. So hopefully they kind of reflect that multi-sensory vibe that May has going on in the exhibit. This first poem is called Age of Plastic. The doctor presses the plastic probe against my pregnant wife's belly. Plastic leaches estrogenic and toxic chemicals. Ultrasound waves pulse between plastic, tissue, fluid, and bone until the embryo echoes. Plastic makes this possible. My wife labors at home in an inflatable plastic tub. Plastic disrupts hormonal and endocrine systems. After delivery, she stores her placenta in a plastic freezer bag. Plastic is the perfect creation because it never dies. Our daughter sucks on a plastic pacifier. Whales, plankton, shrimp, and birds confuse plastic for food. The plastic pump whirls, breast milk drips into a plastic bottle. Plastic keeps food, water, and medicine fresh. Yet, how empty plastic must feel to be birthed, used, then disposed by us, degrading creators. In the oceans, 1 ton of plastic exists for every 3 tons of fish. How free plastic must feel when it finally arrives to the paradise of the Pacific Gyre. Will plastic make life impossible? Our daughter falls asleep in a plastic crib, and I dream that she's composed of plastic so that she too will survive our wasteful hands. The second poem is entitled Disaster Haiku, and it was written after Cyclone Winston, after Typhoon Yutu, after Hurricane Maria, after. Disaster Haiku. The world briefly sees us only after the eye of a storm sees us. This next poem is entitled 13 Ways of Looking at a Glacier, and it's a recycling of a famous Wallace Stevens poem called 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. 13. Among starving polar bears, the only moving thing was the edge of a glacier. 12. We are of one ecology, like a planet in which there were once 200,000 glaciers. 11. The glacier absorbs greenhouse gas. We are a large part of the biosphere. 10. Humans and animals are kin. Humans and animals and glaciers are kin. 9. We do not know which to fear more, the terror of change or the terror of uncertainty, the glacier calving or just after. 8. Icebergs fill the vast ocean with titanic wrecks. The mass of the glacier disappears to and fro, the threat hidden in the crevasse and irreversible claws. 7. Oh, vulnerable humans, why do you engineer seawalls? Do you not see how the glacier already floods the streets of the cities around us? 6. I know king tides and lurid, unprecedented storms, but I know too that the glacier is involved in what I know. 5. When the glacial terminus broke, it marked the beginning of one of many waves. 4. At the tumble of a glacier losing its equilibrium, every tourist in the new Arctic chased ice quickly. 3. Shell explored the poles for offshore drilling. Once we blocked them, in that we understood the risk of an oil spill to a glacier. 2. The sea is rising. The glacier must be retreating. 1. It was summer all winter. It was melting, and it was going to melt. The last glacier fits in our warm hands. This next poem is a sonnet. It's called A Sonnet at the Edge of the Reef, and it takes place at the aquarium here in Waikiki, where I live. A sonnet at the edge of the reef. We dip our hands into the outdoor reef exhibit and touch sea cucumber and red urchin as butterfly fish swim by. A docent explains, once a year after the full moon, when tides swell to a certain height and salt water reaches the perfect temperature, only then will the ocean cue coral polyps to spawn in synchrony a galaxy of gametes, which dances to the surface, fertilizes, opens, forms larvae, roots to seafloor, and grows generation upon generation. At home, we read a children's book, The Great Barrier Reef, to our daughter, snuggling between us in bed. We don't mention corals bleaching, reared in labs or frozen. And isn't our silence too a kind of shelter? This next poem is called Care. It was written for World Refugee Day several years ago, where we had an event in Hawaii to raise awareness and funds about the Syrian refugee crisis. Care. Our daughter wakes from her nap and cries. I pick her up, press her against my chest and whisper, Daddy's here, Daddy's here. Here is the island of Oahu, 8,500 miles from Syria. But what if Pacific trade winds suddenly became flames and shrapnel indiscriminately barreling towards us? What if shadows cast upon our windows aren't plumeria tree branches, but soldiers and terrorists marching? Daddy's here, I whisper. Would we reach the Mediterranean in time? Am I strong enough to straighten my legs into a mast balanced with the pull and drift of the currents? Am I brave enough to bear her across the razor wires of foreign countries and racial hatred? Could I plead, please help us? Please just let us pass. Please, we aren't suicide bombs. Could I keep walking if my feet crack like Halabi pepper fields after 5 years of drought, after this drought of humanity? Daddy's here, Daddy's here. Trains and buses rock back and forth, back and forth to detention centers. But what if our desperate boat capsizes? Could I inflate my body into a buoy to hold her above rough waves? Daddy's here, Daddy. Will drowning be the last lullaby of the sea? Or will we carry each other towards the horizon of care? This next poem is titled One Fish, Two Fish, Plastics, Dead Fish. And it's another recycling poem of course, the famous Dr. Seuss book. One fish, two fish, plastics, dead fish. Some fish are sold for sashimi, some are sold to canneries, and some are caught by hungry slaves to feed what wealthy tourists crave. Farmed fish, fish sticks, frankenfish collapse. From the Pacific to the Atlantic, from the Indian to the Arctic, from here to there, dead zones are everywhere. Overfishing, purse seine, ghost fishing, bycatch. This one has a little radiation. This one has a little mercury. Oh me, oh my, what schools of bloated fish float by. Here are fish that used to spawn, but now the water is too warm. Some are predators and some are prey. Who will survive? I can't say. Say, look at its tumors. 1, 2, 3. How many tumors do you see? 2 fish, 1 fish, filet-o-fish, no fish. This next poem is also about kind of the threats to marine life. It's called Echolocation, and it was written for an orca that scientist named J35. A few years ago, this orca gave birth, but unfortunately its calf was stillborn, yet it carried the calf for a couple of weeks and made the international news and reached Hawaii. So I wrote this poem in dedication for this orca. Echolocation. My wife plays with our daughter while I cook dinner. On the news, we watch you struggle to balance dead calf on your rostrum. Days pass. We drive our daughter to preschool and to the hospital for vaccinations. You carry your child's decomposing body 1,000 nautical miles until every wave is an elegy, until our planet is an open casket. How do you say sorry in your dialect of sonar, calls, and whistles? What is mourning but our shared echolocation? Today, you finally let go so her body could fall and feed others. Somehow, you keep swimming. We walk to the beach so our daughter can build sandcastles. May she grow in the wake of your resilience. May we always remember, love is our wildest oceanic instinct. Okay, my final poem is also the final poem in my book. It's called Praise Song for Oceania. It was written for World Oceans Day that happens every June. Praise Song for Oceania. Praise your capacity for birth, fluid currents and trenchant darkness. Praise our briny beginning, source of every breath. Praise your capacity for renewal, ascent into clouds and descent into rain. Praise your watersheds and hydrologic cycles. Praise your capacity to endure the violation of those who map you aqua nullius, who claim dominion over you, who pillage and divide your body into latitudes and longitudes, who scar your middle passages. Praise your capacity to survive, our trawling boats breaching your open wounds and taking from your collapsing depths. Praise your capacity to dilute our heavy metals and greenhouse gases, sewage and radioactive waste, pollutants and plastics. Praise your capacity to bury our shipwrecks and ruined cities. Praise your watery grave, human reef of bones. Praise your capacity to remember, your library of drowned stories, museum of lost treasures, your vast archive of desire. Praise your tidalectics, your migrant routes and submarine routes. Praise your capacity to smother whales and fish and wash them ashore, to save them from our cruelty, to show us what we're no longer allowed to take, to starve us like your corals are starved, liquid lungs choked of oxygen. Praise your capacity to forgive. Please forgive our territorial hands and acidic breath. Please forgive our nuclear arms and naval bodies. Please forgive our concrete dams and cabling veins. Please forgive our deafening sonar and lustful tourisms. Please forgive our invasive drilling and deep sea mining. Please forgive our extractions and trespasses. Praise your capacity for mercy. Please let my grandpa catch just one more fish. Please make it stop raining soon. Please make it rain soon. Please spare our fragile farms and fruit trees. Please spare our low-lying islands and atolls. Please spare our coastal villages and cities. Please let us cross safely to a land without war. Praise your capacity for healing. Praise your cleansing rituals. Praise your holy baptisms. Please protect our daughter when she swims in your currents. Praise your capacity for hope. Praise your rainbow warrior and peace boat. Praise your Hokulea and sea shepherd. Praise your Arctic sunrise and freedom flotillas. Praise your radical seafarers and native navigators. Praise your activist kayaks and traditional canoes. Praise your whale hunting and shark finning bands. Praise your sanctuaries and no-take zones. Praise your wave and tidal energies. Praise your blue humanities. Praise your capacity for echolocation, our names for you that translate into creation stories and song maps, Tasi, Kai, Tai, Moana Nui, Vasa, Tahi, like Vaitui, Wansowara. Praise your capacity for communion. Praise our common heritage. Praise our pathway and promise to each other. Praise our most powerful metaphor. Praise your vision of belonging. Praise our endless saga. Praise your blue planet, one world ocean. Praise our transoceanic, past, present, future, flowing through our blood. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Craig. I really appreciated being able to hear you read today, to hear you both read today, and, you know, just to really be able to sit with the beauty, complexity, depth, connection that really came up in both of your work. I mean, I want to acknowledge that, you know, these are heavy topics. There's a lot of weight in the histories and memories that you're both so powerfully able to convey. And I guess I want to first give Aracelis a chance to respond to Craig, and likewise, yeah, a chance for you to reflect back to each other. And if you need another second, I do have a few questions that I'm prepared to ask, but I just wanted to give each of you the space to respond first.
Yeah, thank you for that, May. Craig, I was just writing and I didn't finish it, but into the chat, just thank you, Craig. I mean, inside of that thank you are so many thank yous. And there's something about hearing you. I've read that poem before, the poem that you closed with, but hearing you read it, that word capacity, like the sound of the word capacity, I keep hearing a mountain in it, like capacity. It feels capacious, but also like the song of it, like opens a shape in me that is, I'm going to be thinking about, which I'm gonna have so many things to say, but I actually have a question, which is thinking about opening a shape in me. I wanted to hear about the horizon of care, like that phrasing, your phrasing, again, one that I am familiar with, but I would love to hear you talk about like how you came to it, it came to you, what possibility it carries, what space, if you could say anything.
Yes, thank you. Your kind words mean so much to me, as I've admired your work for many years. And thinking about the ocean, of course, is such an or can be, both a horizontal space and a vertical space, as I think May's exhibit features really well.
Mm-hmm.
And growing up on a small island, we're very much surrounded by the horizon part of the ocean, and thinking of what the horizon can be a metaphor for. And for me, in writing that poem, thinking about how far away Syria is from the Pacific, thinking about how we can bridge that gap or that distance between peoples, and of course between or across difference. And so I started, as I was writing that poem, staring off into that oceanic horizon and being haunted by images of parents trying to carry their children to safety, and just thinking about how it will be so important for us to cultivate a sense of empathy and care and love for the other, whether that other be folks from a different culture or of a so-called different species, just for the lands and waters as well. And so that's when the horizon became not just a metaphor for distance and space, but a metaphor for care and intimacy and possibilities of connection. And I think if I could respond to your work as well, reading your book, obviously many years ago, but I still think about the spaces in that book and how you two try to create an intimacy and a touch amongst generations. And as you map the migrations of your various genealogies, and just how you draw attention to that as well. And there's so much depth of emotion in your work. So I guess my question for you is, how did you enter that such a deep space emotionally, writing about the past, present, and the future, these different kinds of tenses and tensions in your work? How do you kind of navigate that really deep emotional space through poetry?
Yeah, I think one of the things that started to happen with this book, maybe in particular, is that I began to feel in a different way the poems as like a kind of, I started using this recently, but like a kind of feeling aware of them as recovery of spirit somehow, and also feeling like the mysteries of how we carry people and places that we might not have had put our eyes on before. But like, I think I think that happened for many different reasons. I think just the urgency and sorrow of these histories. I feel like it actually feels hard to like not imagine toward. I feel like I have to always like remind myself to look towards more than the devastation. Like all the time, I'm just kind of, you know, which feels like an emotional experience of just being in the world. And then something I think too happened, which is you talk about the birth of your first daughter in the reading from just now, but I was pregnant with my son as I was finishing this book, and there's also something about like having witnessed him carrying places and people, or what I feel or sense, or him carrying places and people he has not seen in a certain way before, and like the mysteries of that, which feel like they carry sorrow, but also like, again, the word capacity, like there's something capacious in that carrying that feels like it renews my courage and fight and awe in a beautiful way, in a way that feels not just sorrowful.
Yes, thank you. And it makes me, use the word carrying a couple of times, and there's that phrase carrying capacity that I always find really interesting, and think that, we need to, as people, need to kind of expand our carrying capacity for the world. But when I first heard that phrase, I always thought it was carrying capacity, like what are we capable of carrying? And so as you're answering, I was just thinking about how much of caring is akin to carrying as well, and what is our capacity as people to do that. And of course, the ocean being, a space that just seems to have endless capacity, even though we know that that capacity too can be limited to some degree.
Mm-hmm. There's that moment too, and then I want to hear what other people are thinking and your questions, but there's that moment where you talk about the plumeria branches. Are they branches? The plumeria branches?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The what if they were not branches but soldiers? That, like, that capacity too, like to, how do I say it? There's something there that feels like it reminds me of, or makes me think about this story of this painter who in Eritrea who would paint on the front lines. He was an independence fighter, and there were many people who made paintings in their like downtime in the trenches. And I had the chance to talk with this painter, Haile Burhe, who was showing me these pieces, decades later after the war. And there were so many pieces of paintings of just like trees and hillsides and like beautiful cornfields. And I was so confused and bewildered. I was like, you're painting this then? Like that's not what it looked like. And I couldn't understand with like my limited capacity and imagination or something. I couldn't understand. And he was like, we have to paint what there was so that you will know, we have to, but like something about that feel like that, the plumeria branches and the soldiers, like that juxtaposition, or like the devastation of land and what was there and what will be again, which was what he also was hoping. So how to make it be again,
Yes, I love thinking about our imaginative capacities as well. Mm-hmm. That if we can imagine not only the past and the and the present more vividly, but perhaps to imagine alternative, other, sustainable, decolonial, just futures, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's another capacity that, as artists and poets, we also need to cultivate, so that others can see the world differently too, and perhaps increase their own imaginative capacities.
I think, the conversation about capacity has me thinking a lot about, its opposite in the form of captivity, and specifically the line that you brought up in the Romeo Bearden poem, Aracelis, about teach me how not to assign blackness near the sea to captivity, and to let the sea be the sea. And I really see, that phrase of let the sea be the sea as kind of, the goal of this decolonial just future, right? Of like, what is the possibility of repair, whether it be environmental or correcting the human sacrifice, the regimes that have kind of forced these different modes of dispossession and violence. And I wondered if you could say more about how you see this inner workings between capacity building and the creative imagination against these forms of captivity that have throughout time very much, I think, shaped but not entirely defined the relationship of people of color, people from the global South, people from these different geographies to the sea, and as well to the idea and the imagination of the sea.
Mm-hmm. That's so rich. Shall I should start. I'll start. I'll say a few words and then. I feel like I'm entering from like the slightest little like kind of like pore of your question. But I think, to me, I think there's a kind of constant, awareness of like miseducation and the ways that I've been miseducated or uneducated and have been involved myself in that project. And so like pretty early on, I could feel like trying to disorient myself into a new ways of like thinking and feeling about like my what might be possible, I guess, is maybe the best way of saying it, and different ways of reading and thinking about my history and who was telling me like what the ways of sharing like what history was made up even at all, meaning like, as you said, Craig, like the touches of people, like all the small details of how my family got along, like got along, meaning like in life, like the things people saved, the way that all of those details are in fact kind of have something to do with imaginative strategies, whether we're conscious of them or not. And that there's something, again, this feels like kind of like maybe too simple a way of saying, but I could feel, as I say in that poem, I could feel that I was like taking hostage the greenness of my own mind, that I was like, that I kept, I was so, I am so, and was so terrorized by the catastrophe of it all. And that I had to kind of, and have to train myself to see the beauties, to see people's ways to touch, to love, to, which do and do not have to do with that history. Like that history is so devastating and catastrophic, but it is not the biggest thing, I know it is not the biggest thing. And so that like that work of widening is one that I feel like constantly have to do inside of that pressure of like of captivity, which I'm thinking of all the time. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll just add in a very different context, of course. Many Pacific cultures are seafaring cultures, so our ancestral relationship to the ocean is very much one of intimacy and knowledge, and of course free mobility. But when European imperialism arrived in the Pacific in the 16th century, they essentially banned open ocean navigation and then even in some places like burn the canoes and forbid people from sailing beyond the reef. And it was a way to, of course, hold native populations captive, made it easier to conquer as well as to missionize. And so, these seafaring traditions were lost for many centuries throughout the Pacific. Until very recently, just maybe in the past 50 years or so, we have been starting to revitalize these navigation traditions and to relearn how to build canoes and to sell them just based on traditional techniques. And so definitely when I think of captivity, I think of that long legacy of colonialism in the Pacific. And kind of, then, as Aracelis kind of alluded to, that kind of dreaming beyond that catastrophe, the resurgence of indigenous cultures and the relearning of our intimacies and kinship with the ocean through the canoe and through navigational techniques.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like the question of, what are the points of entry that we have into recuperating these stolen traditions and to reckoning with these different forms of catastrophes is such an important one. And in the previous sessions, we've really been grappling with this question of the relationship to, to a colonial archive, to how different artists, writers, archaeologists, divers engage with the question of, the written record versus different kinds of oral traditions, or even different material traces, whether it's following porcelains or artifacts that are washing up on the shores from different time periods and different political, ecological crises. And so I'm wondering for each of you, how do you wrestle with this relationship to the archive? Do you see your work as a kind of alternative or relational world making, counter history, counter archive? I guess I'm putting out a couple different kinds of terms, keeping it open-ended to how you might define it for yourself. But how do you wrestle with these different tools for correcting the kinds of myths and misinformation, diseducation, hegemonic histories that we've been socialized into around these processes of mobility and relating to, in this context, oceanic or maritime spaces?
I guess I can go first. That's a huge question. In a lot of my work, my previous books as well, perhaps more so, I engaged with colonial archives, and partly I want to subvert and challenge and critique the discourses that arrive from these particular archives, but at the same time I want to look for traces of indigenous presence and survival, and to highlight those in my own work. I often write in a kind of documentary style as well, where I do quote from many archival sources, kind of to deterritorialize the archive within the space of the poem, and then also to try to kind of sweep up that language into the currents of a poetic language. And so this is a lot of different things that I think I try to do with the archive. Obviously, in the last poem I wrote, I do mention certain kinds of archives and discourses around the ocean, and that last poem was a way to put in a kind of textual whirlpool all these different ways that the ocean is represented, and to think about the page itself as an oceanic space, words as kinds of islands, perhaps phrases and sentences as archipelagos. And so so many different ways to think about the archive, but that's I'm still learning as an artist, but those are some of my experiments with that question.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I feel like I have I'm thinking of like specific archives that are called archives, like in which that word is, where that word is used, and how I think like probably many people have a really vexed relationship, even when folks are like sharing their own archives, where I feel like, oh, like, should I be seeing this? Did everybody say yes? What are the, and also I feel like I'm somebody who has, who feels so far away from so many of the, of my people's home spaces or home places. And so in some ways, in many ways, old photographs and writings or like log books of the Italians in the port, like, even though I don't speak in Eritrea, even though I don't speak Italian, but like looking for traces of things, like, as you say, I that has been my work and practice. And also I've always had a vexed relationship to it, because I know what so much of that saving and documenting, or the photographs, depending on who took them, that's always my wonder, who took this photograph. And so for that reason too, I also have like my own vexed relationship to what I say and carry publicly, and want to somehow show my hand, or like the specificity of like my own sight or vision, as much as I can. But I don't know that I don't think of myself as like creating an anti-something, or I just I feel like I'm always wanting to hear everyone's way of thinking and feeling, and I just feel like this is something that I can share, but please ask questions and see all the holes and spots, and see my hand all through it. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that the kind of like the commitment to like the iterative and the open-endedness of the research process is something that's so important, not just as we're resisting the urge to give privilege to the colonial archive, but also just to these kinds of false notions of finality, expertise, authority, especially knowing where those traditions emerge from, and the kinds of violence that are attached to that. And I think that with the exhibition, we've been working a lot through this tension between, like the secret, the spectacle, and, there's something about the fact that most of the things that are so-called secret or quiet, like lots of people know about them. It's just a matter of like, are they legible within particular knowledge formations, like who has access. And, you know, I think, Craig, you had used the language of like thinking from a small island before, and just like Deborah Jack last week or a couple weeks ago in our session was talking about in the context of the horizon being in St. Martin, and this idea of if you're in a place where you can constantly smell the ocean, see the ocean, you're surrounded with these very rich traditions. Like that's very different from even being on a bigger island, being in a peninsula, being in an industrialized port city. So just thinking about, you know, the lived experience versus, you know, the stuff that's common knowledge to lots of folks, but doesn't make its way into the boxes in the national libraries and archives. And so, you know, I'm wondering, you know, there was the theme of silence, and I think of witnessing, which doesn't, you know, necessarily lend itself to the idea of like the spectacle dominant, but, you know, just how you see these themes of maybe not absence, but I think hidden in plain sight, stories and histories about these oceanic crossings, like playing out in your own work and how you think about these trajectories.
Yes, thank you for that brilliant question. You know, I've actually written before about how, you know, our islands, especially in the Western Pacific, are small enough to hide the crimes of empire. And I think the ocean is also space that has been vast enough to hide the crimes of empire as well. And so, you know, so much of my work has been to kind of expose those crimes and to critique them and to highlight, you know, not only because these injustices have been hidden from our own people at times, but of course from the larger world as well. And so, you know, the poem Disaster Haiku was kind of about that thinking where, you know, all these hurricanes and typhoons are, you know, have been impacting very small islands, or just island spaces disproportionately due to climate change. But the international media only covers these places when, you know, as I say, the eye of a storm sees us, right? And it's only very briefly for that spectacle. And it's similarly true for climate change, where now there's, you know, suddenly a global interest in islands that are low lying or about to quote unquote disappear, vanish under rising seas. So, you know, it's that kind of spectacular disaster and catastrophe that makes people care and interested for a moment. But for me, it's really, as you're kind of speaking to, it's the everyday lives of these places and the very human experiences of people from these places that I think matter most and more than these spectacles, because I think those kinds of representations often flatten our humanity and our experiences. And I think it's, you know, up to, you know, poets and artists and of course journalists and so on to tell these on the ground stories that really capture, you know, the depth of our cultures and experiences and histories and so on.
Yeah, and as you're saying that too, Craig, I'm going back to your question, May, before this one, but thinking about like the idea of like a monolith, which I am against. I am against a monolith of knowledge, or the archive as the monolith way of recording aware. And I'm thinking about how, like, just how what you say about the everyday, Craig, just how critical, like those everyday experiences of even like an hour, a single hour or a second even. That in there we know how things have come to be how they are, like in all the plural ways of thinking about how they are. And like one of the things I think about a lot is like with my own kids, and when I worked with high schoolers, and when I think about myself in high school, like if we don't hear those ways, and if we're not hearing each other, like listening towards those ways, then how do we know that like then we think like things just, we are here, like things just happen to be, so that like it, like there's a way that like it's just so important to know that this is, I know that natural is a hard word, but like, you know, things just didn't become like this without some terrible imagination, and devastations, but like that we can say, you know, this is some of how we came to be here, which feels so critical, especially when I think about young people. You know, how critical it is to know that this was of a terrible design. You know, this is not the natural order of things.
And I think, you know, just building on that, you know, the question of what it means to be here, a lot of what's come up in both of your readings today is just this kind of, it's not a tension, it's really putting, you know, the work of particularity to use in a way that allows us to think about, you know, the everywhere, the interconnections, to see, you know, what it means to build solidarity with Syria from the specific position of being in Hawaii, and to think about these different crossings. And I think that, you know, like holding in tension the how did we get to where we are, but then thinking about the where we are as very much not a question that could be answered within nation state boundaries, or within any type of rigid partition, but constantly stretching out to look outside elsewhere to track those processes that, you know, might not be immediately apparent, but we can see that there are always these interconnections, and we can also understand those as potential for other worlding, building these kinds of solidarities and relationships. And I want to invite audience members again to ask, we have time for maybe one or two questions or observations if anybody wants to step into the conversation. Can either pose in the chat or unmute. And if not, I will give you both a chance to offer any final remarks. And thank you again for just such a generative and really rich and really just very powerful and intentional conversation that we've been able to have together.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to you each. Thank you, May, for gathering us. It feels really, really like a gift. Thank you.
Yeah, but I want to say thank you as well. I think the ocean is such a powerful metaphor, you know, especially when we think of oceanic currents, different currents coming together. And I think, May, you really brought so many currents within the exhibition, and just here bringing us together in this space. And, you know, the ocean as again, a space of connection and flow, just the way that you have created these currents to flow across all these medium, and to create these deep conversations, I think has been really powerful, and just so honored to be a part of it today. So thank you.
Thank you.